So there's also a saying, a story that a Hasidic Rebbe once told his disciples, his students, we need to move with the times. And some of his Hasidim were a little perplexed. What does it mean to move with the times? Should we adapt our Torah practices to the fleeting fashions of the day? And then he said, parashat Shavua, the Torah, weekly Torah portion. That's about moving with the times. So we're moving with the times, and we are now in the fourth of the five books of the Torah, the book of Numbers, in Hebrew, Bamidbar, in the desert. Lots of mayhem in the desert. We have had Miriam and Aaron speaking ill of Moses. We have had the spies, the 10 of the 12 top leaders, the heads of the tribes, speaking ill of the land of Israel, defeatism, we could never get there. We said it's also a teaching about spiritual defeatism. It's when, God forbid, we look at the obstacles we have in our lives to do better. And we say, no, it's just too hard. You know what, I'm going to start working out now. I'm going to be proactive in all these areas of my life. I'm more comfortable. Another failure we had, there are tons of failures in the book of Numbers, is Korach, right? We read about Korach last Shabbat. Korach was a billionaire in today's time. He was a Levite. So not only was he very wealthy, he was also spiritual aristocracy, mover and shaker, prominent member of society. But all this was not enough. He also wanted to take over Moses' leadership, failed miserably, and that was the beginning of his demise. In our parasha today, parashat Chukat, which is the fifth Torah portion of the book of Numbers, we have one of the most famous episodes, probably the most tragic spiritual episode in the entire Torah narrative, and that is when Moses hits the rock rather than addresses the rock, and Hashem proclaims that because of this failure, he and Aaron will not merit to enter the Holy Land. They're not going to get a visa at the Egyptian consulate in the Sinai Peninsula to enter Israel. And that could ruin your whole day, especially if that's your life's dream. That's a very important teaching for us, because our sages teach us, En Adam yotzeh min ha'olam v'chatzi ta'avato beyado. Nobody leaves this world with half their aspirations and desires fulfilled. Even the great Moses, the greatest Jewish leader and rabbi and sage of all times, was barred from fulfilling his greatest dream, his lifelong goal to enter Israel. Not going to happen. By the way, it brings to mind, that Dr. King, his last speech in April 1968 in a church in the South, he said, my eyes have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I promise you we will get there as a people. You can watch it on YouTube, you'll get chills all over your body. The next morning he was shot. It was like a prophetic statement. I may not get there with you, but I promise you we'll get there as a people. So this is a very important teaching for us humans, that George Michael once had an album in the 80s called Listen Without Prejudice. And in that album he has a song that he sings, you can't always get what you want. So that's a big teaching. Nobody always gets what they want, even Moses. We'll see it later in Parashat Va'etchanan. Okay, so we'll get to that as well. But first things first. Let's go back to the chronological order. Parashat Chukat can be found
761.
Thank you, Mark, on page 761.
I thought it was 757.
Actually, it starts
757.
757. Sounds like models of airplanes. 757. Second half of the page, second paragraph. In our Chumash, you might have a different edition, Mark, that's okay. So 757.
Oh yeah.
Parashat Chukat.
I'm wrong. You're right.
So it's okay. It happens occasionally. And Parashat Chukat. So first of all, what does the word Chukat means? We have a typology. We have an analytical distinction of the different kind of mitzvot. One way to think of the mitzvot is the active and the passive, the do's and the don'ts. What are the do's? Say a blessing before you eat and drink. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'akol nהיה b'dvaro, right? It's an active, positive mitzvah. What's a don't? A negative mitzvah? Don't steal. Don't eat pork, right? So we have the do's and the don'ts, the active and the passive, the proactive and the refraining from. Secondly, another division is what I call hierarchical or topographical, if you like. We have horizontal mitzvot with each other, how to treat each other, let's say in business. And we have the vertical mitzvot with God, like the obligation, the spiritual obligation to ourselves, to others, to pray, to meditate, so that we can cultivate our inner core and center ourselves. So another distinction that we have in terms of the mitzvot is threefold. The first one I'll start with is called edut, A-D-U-T, transliterated into English, Aleph, Dalet, Vav, Taf in Hebrew. Edut means the testimonial laws. For example, Shabbat. When we choose to desist from certain worldly activities on Shabbat, not only are we creating for ourselves a spiritual cocoon that we can focus on being with our loved ones and family and community and meditating and learning and buffering the world for one day, giving us the bliss of a reprieve, but we're also rendering testament that God is the creator of the cosmos. Right? If you look at the liturgy for Shabbat, we say on Friday night, what is Shabbat? Ot hi le'olam. It is an eternal sign, reminder that God is the creator of the world. Right? So these are testimonial laws. That's one example of a testimonial law. On Shabbat, we attest that the Infinite One is the creator. The second division we have, that I'm going to say now, is called Mishpatim. M-I-S-H-P-A-T-I-M. Mem Shin Pei Tet Yud Mem. Mishpatim are the universal laws. For example, in the Ten Commandments it says, do not murder, do not steal. Any human civilization worth its name embraces the Mishpatim. These are universal laws of universal human dignity and decency. Right? The universals. And then come the Chukim. C-H-U-K-I-M. The Chukim. The Chukim are the esoteric, uniquely Jewish mitzvot. For example, not eating meat with dairy. People come up with all kinds of hypotheses, which is very appealing. There's a whole spiritual sport that rabbis like and love, including me, which is called ta'amei mitzvot, the purposes of the mitzvot. And then we conjecture and we say, well, this is why we don't eat meat with dairy. Because the pagan civilizations in the ancient Near East used to do it, so we rendered ourselves distinct. But not only that. Let's think about what we're doing when we're having a cheeseburger. So, my wife used to nurse her kids when my kids were little. So, imagine there was a species bigger than us. Big dinosaurs would come, and they would hunt my kid to eat it, and they would cook my kid, God forbid, in its mother's milk. So what's going on here? The mother's milk that we take from the cow is really meant to feed her offspring, her children, so to speak. So when we take a life, which is what we do when we consume meat, and we put in dairy, according to Rabbi Kook, who was a great Kabbalist and the first chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Israel, 1865 to 1935, Rabbi Kook explains that when you're eating meat with dairy, symbolically, you are conflating, you are mixing murder and thievery, killing and thievery. Why? Because we killed the animal in order to eat it, but we're also using the milk that's supposed to be a source of life, of nourishment from the altar. So by refraining from eating meat and dairy, we're making a statement about the sanctity of life and the respect for life. That even though the Torah is pragmatic, and if you want to eat meat, you can eat certain kinds of meat, not predatorial meat, because predators devour their victims, and we don't want to take in that kind of energy of predators. That's why predators are never kosher. But it's like a statement. We're still sensitive to life, so we're not going to conflate the meat and the dairy together, because the dairy should be a source for life. But that is not in the Torah. These are rabbinic commentaries that come later to explain the mitzvah. I'll give you an example of the quintessential chok. It says in the Torah, in the book of Deuteronomy, we'll read later on this summer, God willing, it says that when you wear something, we go to Rodeo Drive, you buy a cheap $5,000 suit. I'm just kidding. Make sure that my father was telling me when he was here a couple of months ago, he went to the store in the new Waldorf Astoria, and he saw a jacket, just a suit jacket for $12,000. Anyway, I wonder how many people on the planet would buy that. I couldn't resist. But the Torah says we should refrain from wearing a piece of clothing that's made from wool and linen just juxtaposed together. It's very strange, right? It's an irrational, esoteric law. So let me show you something cool. Actually, this jacket I bought, it's Hugo Boss. And I no longer wear Hugo Boss because I learned that they used to make the uniform for the Nazi army, for the Wehrmacht. That's my choice. I'm not telling anyone.
Is that true?
Yeah, I'm not saying to anybody not to do it, but that's what I'm doing. But my brother told me that actually. But it's just a personal choice. But you see, it's stitched here because it has wool and linen. It's really an irrational thing. I actually read a beautiful explanation for that. That what do you call it? That why do we not conflate wool and linen? Because what is wool? Wool you shave off a sheep. You confiscate from someone. You take from something, from someone, from an animal. Linen is something you make yourself. So don't mix the things that you take from somebody else and the things that you earn yourself. Understand in life, just have the basic understanding that what you got from your parents is not the same as what you earned yourself. We should have that ability. But that's an explanation. It's not in the Torah. Do you understand what I mean? The Torah just said, don't mix wool and linen. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So these are the chukim. The mitzvot that as we encounter them do not necessarily immediately resonate with us, with our common sense, if you like, and we have to look deeper in order to excavate meaning. And our parashat is called Chukat because it's the quintessential, non-comprehensible, esoteric mitzvah. So if you want to follow in the book, it's on page 757, verse 1. I'll give you my own translation. Vaydaber Hashem Moshe v'Aaron le'emor. Hashem emailed or WhatsApped Moses and Aaron, and he told them, this is Chukat HaTorah. This is the quintessential, non-rational law in the Torah. Talk to the children of Israel on Skype. Ve'ikhu elecha fara adumat temima. And let them grab a hold of a red heifer, a red cow temima, that has no blemish, completely red. Doesn't exist in our days. Asher en bamum, has no blemish. Asher lo ala alea hol, that was never worked. and bring it, says verse 3, to Elazar Kohen, Aaron's son, and he'll take that cow out of the camp and slaughter it. And then this whole process is being detailed that I'm not going to walk us through the entire process, but the whole purpose of that very esoteric ritual with the red cow, heifer, and its remains was an ancient ritual in enabling people who came into contact with a corpse, with a carcass, or even with a dead animal, to be spiritually eligible again to worship. So there's something psychological going on here, that the Torah is sensitive to what happens to us when we encounter death. There was a great German philosopher in the 20th century called Martin Heidegger, a very important philosopher. Unfortunately, at some point became a Nazi, but that's a totally different conversation. But he was a genius. What can you do? And Heidegger says that the most cardinal feature of the human condition is Sein zum Tode, which is German for being towards death. We're all going to die, but nobody wants to think about it. Who wants to think about the fact that there's going to be a tombstone with their names on it and the years that they lived? Who wants to think about the fact that one day it's going to be their Shiva and everybody's going to go from the cemetery and eat bagels? Nobody wants to think about it. You have to repress it. So that you have to compartmentalize so you can function and make sense of the world. Otherwise, what's the point of schlepping around and making an effort if we always remember the fact that we're just here for a few decades and it's nothing, right?
But
It says, sorry?
It's the history. Future is history.
It's, okay.
It says, future is mystery. Future is mystery.
It's, but it's inevitable and factual that we're just going to die and disintegrate. So, it actually says in the Psalms that we read every morning, physically, I'm not talking spiritually, right? The soul is eternal. We read every Shabbat in the Psalms, we read in the morning, a human lifespan is 7 decades or 8 decades. I guess if you're really lucky, 10 decades, a little more maybe. And then, and most of it is v'rahavam amal va'aven. And most of the time, we toil, we just work. V'gaz chish v'naufa. And then we evaporate like gas. Poof, it's over. Ask any person in their 9th or 10th decade, did life go by fast? I say, boy, did it go fast, right? It's like a blink of an eye. So, something happened to us when we encounter death. I remember when I was a kid growing up in Israel in the Middle East, even if you would see a dead cat on the street, there would be something that, or God forbid it, I once saw, I'm sorry if it's upsetting to someone, once saw a dog that was run over. You see a carcass, even of an animal, there's something that can shake you a little bit when you see it, because it's lifeless. And I think it's because it reminds us subconsciously of our own mortality. So, the rabbis of old, the Torah rather, not the rabbis, the Torah itself stipulated in antiquity that when you encountered death in your face, you'd go through this cleansing process that would help you go back to the domain of the living and help you shake off the shock, the discomfort after having faced death in such an unmediated way. Okay? So that was really the purpose of that ancient ritual, which is no longer effective in our time. In our time, there's no temple, there are no Kohanim schlepping around in the temple. This is not pertinent to our time. What is? I'll tell you what is. Verse 14 is, for example, go to verse 14 on page 759. It says, this is a verse that was used by the rabbis to teach us something very deep about life and about the essence of Jewish life in particular. It says, Zot HaTorah, Adam ki yamut ba'ohel. This is the Torah. It means this is this specific law, but really the rabbis of later generations also interpreted it, expounded it to mean this is the Torah. He comes a general rule of thumb about the Torah writ large. Adam ki yamut be'ohel. Adam, a human being, will die in a tent. Tent means an indoor dwelling. It doesn't matter if it's a $50 million home in Bel Air or if you live in a tent or a caravan, you're gonna die. Right? And if you remember it in a constructive way, you're gonna go places. I said on Shabbat that Yoni Netanyahu, Israel's great military hero who died on the raid on Entebbe, who was a philosopher and a poet and went to Harvard and was Prime Minister Netanyahu's older brother, he wrote when he was 16 and 17 that he wants to be able to give himself accountability for what he does with his life every day of his life, not only in old age when he sees death staring him in the face. And similarly, Steve Jobs, in his commencement speech at Stanford years ago, when he was in remission from cancer, he doesn't think it was going to come back, unfortunately it did. He says that he had a rule of thumb in his life that every day he would wake up, he'd look himself in the mirror and ask himself in his head, in his consciousness, if today were to be the last day of his life, would he still want to be doing what he's doing today? And he said when too many days in the row would be no, he knew that he needed to make a change. And then he says that death, he said to the students, death is life's greatest agent of change. Knowing that you're going to die should liberate you to make the most of the time that you have. Because, Job says, in face of death, all sense of shame and social propriety and fear simply withers away. So great geniuses do that. They understand that if they're not here forever, it doesn't mean that we should get depressed. It means that we should actually feel empowered to do what we really want to do and not be afraid of what other people think. You know, the Shulchan Aruch, Judaism's seminal halachic code from the 16th century, starts with the words Ke'ari itgaber. A person should overcome like a lion his inner inertia, whether it's physical or mental, and summon himself to worship the Creator. And that's written by Rabbi Joseph Caro, the great Sephardic author of the Shulchan Aruch. But the Ramah, the Ashkenazi commentator, explains what does it mean to overcome like a lion. He says, Shelo yityareh min hamal'igim alav, which means lest he be intimidated by those who mock him. Oftentimes in life we're just paralyzed, but what are other people going to think if I make this or that change in my life? Which brings us to a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying by an Australian nurse who worked for many long years in palliative care. She wrote this book saying, what are the 5 things that people regret most on their deathbed? And you know what's the most common regret that she encountered that people said? Fasten your seatbelts. It says, I wish I lived the life that I really wanted to live and not the life that those around me expected me to live. So, Zot HaTorah Adam ki yamut ba'oel. This is a cardinal rule of thumb in the Torah. Adam ki yamut ba'oel. We're just, every person, their day is going to come when their soul leaves their body. And the idea of a tent is an indoor dwelling. Like we said, the tent doesn't have to be a tent. It could be a $50 million home. Right? As we say in a Shiva home, we read Psalm 49 between Mincha and Arvit in the evening. Ki lo v'moto yikach hakol. We don't take any of our physical possessions with us when we leave this world. We emerge into this world out of the womb without any physical possessions, and that's how we return. So everything is on a lease. Not only our cars, those of us who lease our cars, everything is on a lease. We don't own anything for perpetuity. In addition to that, there's another important meaning to this verse. Zot HaTorah Adam ki yamut ba'oel. This is the Torah. Should a person die in the tent? There are two schools of thoughts here. One rabbinic school of thought is that if you really want to go places in terms of your spiritual growth, you need to completely nullify your ego. What they call in Hasidism, which is the psychology of Kabbalah, really, you have to achieve bitul hayesh. You need to kind of set your ego aside. You need to cancel, nullify yourself before the will of God. So, and only when a person really wants to do nothing but serve God and does that, then he could really lead a life of profound spirituality. There's the only liturgical segment, the only part of the Jewish prayer service that's taken directly from the book of Zohar, which is the main work of the Kabbalah, is Brich Shmei Demare Alma, which is an Aramaic section from the book of Zohar, parashat Vayakhel, that we read right before we take out the Torahs, Monday, Thursday, Shabbat, Jewish holiday. And there you find a verse, Anna avdat kutsha bricho. I am the servant of the Holy One, blessed be He. So there are sages who tell us, if you really want to be super spiritual, you have to nullify your ego before God and the exigencies, the demands, the expectations of the Torah. Then there's another school of thought that puts an emphasis on a different verse, a verse from parashat Kedoshim, which we read a few months ago. And that verse says, you should uphold my statutes and my laws, v'chai bahem, and you should live by them. In other words, that the purpose of the Torah and Jewish life is to give us simcha, to give us profound joy, that it shouldn't be, God forbid, an endeavor, spiritual life, that brings us down. The Torah is a Torah of life, Torat Chaim, like we say in the last paragraph of the Amidah. So there are these two perspectives. On the one hand, and they're complementary, they're both right. On the one hand, if I really want to grow, I can't stay in my comfort zone. I have to push myself out of my comfort zone and do things that are hard for me, and kind of nullify my ego in that sense. On the other hand, the purpose of Torah is to live in joy. We're not the kind of religion that tells its spiritual elite, like in Catholicism, the priests and the nuns, if you really want to be spiritual, you can never have physical intimacy, no sex, no marriage, no kids. That's not us, right? We're the antithesis of that. V'chai b'hem. You should found life and joy, right? In Islam, alcohol is forbidden. In Judaism, it's the way we celebrate all the great occasions. Shabbat, Jewish holiday, chuppah, marriage, brit milah. We always take life's sensuous pleasures, like alcohol, and we make them also spiritual. We integrate physical and spiritual enjoyment together. So this is, I think, a very deep teaching that the rabbis give us about Jewish spiritual life. On the one hand, the Torah wants us to embrace life's pleasures and live through them. And on the other hand, we do have to kind of sometimes set our ego aside in order to really grow in soul. Okay? So that was that. Yes. Yes.
So what are we supposed to think about the ritual, which seems to be more of an act of superstition rather than a reality? I mean, taking the ashes and mixing it with water for the...
So as I said, this is Chukat. This is a non-rational, non-comprehensible, maybe the quintessential non-comprehensible Jewish law. My only answer to you would be not from me, but from the leading anthropologist of the 20th century. He was a French Jew, and his name was Claude Lévi-Strauss. And he was a Holocaust refugee. He came to America, to the New School. And Claude Lévi-Strauss coined the term cultural relativism, which means that we are children of a certain culture. in America, we're children of the modern Western vantage point of looking at things. And it's very easy when we are part of one culture, any culture, to look at another culture, and when we don't understand something, to denigrate it. But what Claude Lévi-Strauss says is every culture doesn't only have content, it also has context. And if you're not really literate in that culture in the profound sense of the term, then you can't really understand it. You know, I remember I had a conversation with a friend of mine who happens to be ultra-Orthodox. You know, Baruch Hashem, I have friends from self-proclaimed atheists to anything until ultra-Orthodox. And we were talking about great academic scholars of Judaism and Kabbalah and Hasidism. He told me something I really agree with. He says, you know, the academic scholars who really get Kabbalah and Jewish mysticisms are those who also practice, at least occasionally, because they also understand the experiential component of that culture. If you're not part of that culture, you cannot really understand it internally. You cannot really understand it in its very core, right? I'll give you a funny example, a silly example I like to give. Suppose there is a great professor, a scholar, who decides to write a scholarly work about the history of the French kiss. When did people start French kissing? And he would find out that actually it started in Africa. It's not even a French kiss, it's an African kiss. And he'll write the whole story of how the French kiss developed. And he'll read 1,000 novels about love and French kissing. If he never loved anyone and French kissed him or her, then he doesn't really understand the French kiss, although he could be the world expert theoretically on the French kiss. So that's, I think, hopefully a useful comment about how we should be prudent when we look at cultures that we don't really know and understand at first glance. The first time I ever took a Oh no, I lost my connectivity. The first time I ever... Oh no, it's good. Technical error. The first time I took a class in sociology, it was in high school. I remember the teacher taught us a story about the Yakirama tribe. And it was a story about an anthropologist who went to visit the Yakirama tribe. And the Yakirama tribe has very weird rituals. They stab themselves with little needles every day in the mouth, and then they have beautiful shrines where they attend to their bodily needs, where they sit and do what the body needs to do to relieve itself of its waste. And then at the end of the class, she explains to us, Yakirama is America spelt backwards. And this guy, supposedly, it's a story, it's not a real story, he saw people brushing their teeth. So he thought they were stabbing themselves. And he noticed that in many homes, the bathroom looks really luxurious. So that's how he looked at it, you understand? I think it's a great story that teaches us maybe cultural humility. Right? When we look at cultures, we should always understand that even though we might know the content, we're not necessarily understanding the context. Okay?
Sorry, just since you said it is from the
Oh, sure.
So sorry.
Of course, no.
So should we practice it?
No, it's not. This is not applicable in our times. Okay, so So let's continue now. We have to understand these things are conceptual. They're not physical, they're conceptual. These are ideas. You know, it's kind of like people living in Texas, a mile and a half of each other on the two sides of the Mexican and the American border. There is nothing physically factual about the fact that here is the United States and here is Mexico. It's a political concept that this is Mexican sovereignty and this is American sovereignty. So similarly, in Torah concepts, it's not something about physical, it's something conceptual. The idea of holy and not holy, spiritually eligible and not spiritually eligible, these are conceptual things, okay? Now, I want us to move after the continuous explication of the laws of the red heifer. I want us to go to verse, the next thing we have, page 761, verse 1, hello Judith, is the passing of Miriam.
Yeah.
You know, Miriam passed away, and then they don't have water. It says in verse 2, the people don't have water. So first of all, there's a midrash, there's a rabbinic story that it's Miriam's presence, that she had a portable well with her that would satiate the people's need to drink in the desert. So what's a deeper understanding of this midrash? Most people couldn't understand Moses, maybe. He had to go through Aaron, and maybe sometimes Miriam explained things informally to the people, because Moses was a removed genius. His brother Aaron was the people's person for him. And maybe Miriam too, maybe she taught her own little Torah classes. And when she was gone, people felt spiritually dehydrated for Torah. Okay? And that's how this whole thing starts. And then in verse 3, on page 763, the people quarreled with Moses and tell them, if only we died like our brothers did, those who didn't believe in going into Israel and perished in the desert. Why did you bring us here to this desert to die here? You know, you see the lack of gratitude that Moses was subjected to. It's just hair-raising. Right? And verse 5, why did you elevate us from Egypt to bring us to this evil place where there is nothing to drink and not even figs to eat? This is very good for us when we encounter lack of gratitude in our lives. Whether it's in a work setting, whether it's in a family setting, it's an ugly side of human nature, right? And we somehow need to be able to stomach it. And maybe we can draw some consolation and strength from recalling that even Moses was subjected to this unspeakable lack of gratitude.
Were they still getting manna at this time?
Yes, yes. And Moses and Aaron address the people, and they go to the tent of meeting before Hashem's presence. That will be on Shabbat, the end of the second Aliyah. And then on verse 7, on 763, God gives the instructions to Moses and tell him, take the staff, congregate the entire Jewish people, and address the rock, and let them take water, and draw for them water from the rock, and you will quench their thirst. And Moses, 763 verse 10, instead of addressing the rock, first of all, Moses lost his temper. And that can happen to everyone. And it does happen to most people. We're all human, all too human, in Nietzsche's words. Maimonides teaches us, Maimonides was really into moderation. Like the British say, moderation is a good thing in everything, especially in moderation. That's supposed to be a joke. It means don't do everything in moderation. Sometimes you can do a little bit of excess. Maimonides says everything in moderation. He was a big fan of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, who was into the golden mean of moderation, except two things. Humility. No, arrogance is just a terrible thing. And the other thing is anger. It's okay to feel angry, but to act out our anger is destructive. To us, not only to those around us, but also to ourselves. It says that when a person is angry, their wisdom departs from them. And in American English, it's very telling, right? If we lose our temper, we do something and then we regret it, what do people say? I'm sorry, I lost it. I lost it, right? What did we lose? We lose, at that moment, our sense of judgment. We lose our equilibrium. So Moses lost it. And that's the big part of the beauty of the Torah, that, again, to quote Nietzsche, even the greatest spiritual people of all times, like Moses and King David, they made mistakes. They messed up. And they also had to pay for their mistakes. That's why the Torah says in Parashat Nitzavim, which we always read before Rosh Hashanah, Lo b'shamayim hi. The Torah is not in the heaven. The Torah is not some pie-in-the-sky fairy tale like Greek mythology. It's not a story about people who are people are always infallible and perfect. The Torah gives us real role models of people who attained greatness, but they also erred and they failed and they made mistakes. Mm-hmm. And that includes Moses. So first of all, notice when Moses is, losing his temper, he's telling them in verse 8, Shim'un hamorim, listen, you rebels. Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. Do you think we're going to get water out of this rock? And he's saying, Notzi, we will do it, not God will do it. Me and Aaron. So there's an attribution here of what God does to human agency. And in that respect, it's a problem. We're going to read this summer that it's going to say in the Torah that there will become a time in which we will flourish and will have beautiful homes and prosper, like some do in Beverly Hills and some do in Israel. And that's a danger. That's a dangerous territory spiritually. Why? It says, be careful not to say kochi ve'otzem yadi, not to say that my strength and my might gave me this. Ve'zacharta et Hashem lokach. Remember Hashem your God. Ki hu hanoten lecha koach la'asot chai. Hashem, God gave you the strength to do what you're doing. And it's good to be humble about it. Yeah, I'll give you another example. I remember when Shimon Peres was Prime Minister of Israel in the 80s, he got the IDF, the Israeli army, to pull out of most of Lebanon. And he really fought for it hard, and finally he got to approve it in the cabinet by a margin of 1 vote. And then he went out to the press, and you know what he said? He said in Hebrew, we got the IDF out of Lebanon. He didn't say, I, the Prime Minister, we got the IDF. So that's something that doesn't happen here. Moses is saying, a little later, Moses is saying, will we get the water for you, rather than God? And then it says in verse 11 that he struck the rock twice, and then water came out. And I think that it's instructive that right before that Miriam died. And later on in this Torah portion, Aaron is also going to die. Miriam and Aaron were the human elements who served as intermediaries between Moses and the people. Moses, to remind us, grew up as a billionaire in Pharaoh's palace. Pharaoh was a terrible tyrant and despot. He was also the wealthiest individual in the ancient Near East. So he grew up as a billionaire in the home, the palatial home of the wealthiest individual at that point in time, and he was the greatest spiritual genius of all times, together with Abraham, perhaps. How can you relate to a person like that? Most people can't relate to a person like that. Aaron and Miriam were the human element. When Miriam died, and Aaron also dies in this parsha, that human element was lacking. Now here's another important thing. Some commentators say that, there are many explanations. What was such a big deal about hitting the rock? Is this really a proportionate punishment not to enter Israel? So there are many takes on this. Some of them are that this was just the culmination of other things that also happened. And when Moses was first given the job, at the burning bush, it says in Jewish jobs today, God tells him, I want you to lead the Jewish people. And he didn't really want to. Another explanation that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs gives in one of his articles is that, in a sense, according to one possible Torah perspective, it wasn't even a punishment. It was just that for different historical eras, we need different kinds of leadership. I'll give you, I think, a great historical example. Winston Churchill was the greatest statesman of the 20th century. He saved Britain and the West in some ways from the Nazis taking over Britain. That would have had World War II last many, many more years. Probably wouldn't have had more Jews surviving in Europe. What happened to Winston Churchill after the war? He lost the election in 1945. Sometimes you see great political leaders who achieve independence for their people. But once independence is achieved, you have to move on to what they call in political science nation building, the nitty-gritty of building political institutions and economic institutions. And it's not always the same guy that's the best fit for the job. So according to Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Joshua was the right guy for that new historical phase. Joshua was the one that spoke the language of that new generation. Right? Just like today, if you want to be a 21st century rabbi, you have to be a 21st century kind of person and also use social media and maybe also talk about sport and movies, not like maybe rabbis 100 years ago that were much more removed from their congregants, right? So every generation and every historical era has their own demands, and in some ways that was what was needed for that point in history. Okay?
Question?
Yes.
So God is responsible for the water coming out of the rock.
Yeah.
And so if Moses is hitting the rock and God lets the water come out, then that's God's action. God could just as well have said, oh, he did it wrong, I'm not going to let the water out of the rock. Moses would have said, oh my God, I got it wrong, I have to speak to the rock. And then it would, in other words, God was complicit in all this, and maybe...
Okay, so I'm going to bring us back to a teaching in parashat Balak that we're going to read, is it next week? Balak, yeah, next week. We're going to read parashat Balak. In parashat Balak, it's a whole... I'm not going to say anything about that parsha, and we'll do it next week, God willing. But there's a part where there is somebody in the parsha that wants to go with a group of people who are very negative. And that person was called Balaam. He was a non-Jewish prophet. And he asks God, should I go with these people? Should I go with them or not? They're not the best people. And God tells him, Lechi ma'anashim. If you want to go with these people. And Rashi says something very deep that we should all pay attention to in our own lives and be mindful of. Rashi says, Bamakom she'adam rotzeh lilech, which means to walk, to go in Rabbinic Hebrew, lesham molichim oto. Wherever we want to go, that's where we're taken. You want to go to the synagogue for a Torah class? God bless you. You'll empower yourself. Go to a Torah class. You want to go to this kind of place where they do these kinds of things? God bless you too. You can go there. There will be spiritual, emotional, mental ramifications as well to your decision. But nobody's stopping you. That's the way the world goes. The way the world goes is that we can do whatever we want. And everything that we do has consequences. Right? For good or for bad. Now let's go
how does that apply to the water and the rock?
So it doesn't matter. Even if the water didn't come out, he hid it instead of talking to it. And that's the problem. It doesn't matter that the water came out or not. What matters was that he didn't do what God asked him to do. I mean, that's my perspective. Other people have their own perspective, but that's just my own perspective. The fourth aliyah for this Shabbat is super short, by the way, and it's on our book 765, verse 14. Moses sends malachim. By the way, malachim in Hebrew means both angels and emissaries. And it's a teaching to us that, in a sense, anybody that comes across our way in the middle of this road we come our life is an emissary and an angel. Kabbalah teaches us that there are also negative angels. Somebody appears in your life, social life, professional life, and you curse the day you ever met that person. But that person is here to teach you something. Like what my wise mother says, your torturer is your teacher. There's something to learn even from people who are not the best, and they can really give us a hard time. They can push us to grow in ways that we would not have had we not had to encounter them. So an angel is an emissary, or sometimes it's a guardian angel. Somebody helps you out of nowhere, and that's a terrific thing. In any ways, verse 14, Moses sends emissaries from where they are in Kadesh. There was a 7-Eleven in Kadesh, to the king of Edom. And the king of Edom, the Edomites, Transjordan, where the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is today, they had coffee beans there. Ko amar, nobody's laughing. What am I going to do? Ko amar achicha Israel. Thus, thank you, Judith, for saving me. Thus said your brother Israel. Why your brother Israel? Because the Edomites are descendants of Esau, and we are descendants of Jacob, of Israel. So historically, way back when, we were cousins. So you remember, we're family, right? They were probably singing to him, we are family. Ata yadata et kol atla'a asher matzatanu. And Rashi explains, he says, you know all the travails that we went through, that we were slaves in Egypt. We need a favor. We are on the 405 in the desert, on the way from Egypt to Israel. We need to pass through your kingdom. Now we promise you, we are not going to disturb anyone. Right? They're telling him the whole story of getting out of Egypt, and then they say in verse 17, let us just go through the 405. We're not going to take anything from the trees. We're not going to take any fruit. We're not going to utilize any of your resources. We're not even going to stop at the gas station to use the bathroom. Derech HaMelech, we're going to go the king's highway until we pass through your border. In verse 18, the king of Edom says, Lo ta'avor. I'm not going to let you drive through the 405 in my neck of the woods. And if you do, b'cherev etzeh likatecha. I'm going to meet you with F-16s and tanks. I'm going to meet you with swords. I'm going to fight you. And then we beseech them again. Please, let us just go through on the 405, on the way to Israel. Ve'im imecha nishteh ve'natati michra. And if we're going to stop and drink or eat, we're going to pay. It's going to be good for your economy. No. And then he stepped towards us in verse 20 with a big army and lots of weapons. In verse 21, it says, and the Edom did not allow Israel to pass through his borders, and we had to go to Waze or GPS and recalculate our route. There was a great Jewish philosopher and scientist in Israel called Yeshayahu Leibovich. Once wrote a book about him in Hebrew in Israel. And Yeshayahu Leibovich says that what we can learn from this story here in this parsha is that not everything is ours. We are the Jewish people. We have our land, we have our rights, but everybody has their rights. Non-Jews have their rights, of course, needless to say, individual rights and political rights. Every person has their rights, and every nation has its rights. And we need to respect the political integrity of every nation, right? I think there's a very interesting teaching here, right? That lest we think, maybe there are peoples or nations out there, they think that, that they deserve everything, but that's not the Jewish view. Okay, let's go to the fifth aliyah.
But remember I'm a little confused.
Okay.
Who were the Edomites?
The Edomites were a kingdom in Transjordan, the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. What is Hashemite kingdom of Jordan today? Meaning to the right of Israel, to the east of what Israel is today. Okay? Good?
Okay.
All right. So
Edom's descendants. Edom's
correct.
descendants.
Correct. Now we're getting to the death of Aaron. So Moses is losing both his descendants in 1 year. It reminds me, there was a year, Rabbi Soloveitchik was the leading modern Orthodox rabbi of the 20th century. He lost in 1 year his wife, one of his parents, and his brother. Right? What a terrible year. Here, and Moses is losing in very short intervals both his siblings. And not only were they his siblings that he was shattered by that, it was also a big problem because they were those, as we said, who were the intermediaries between Moses and the people. Okay, so the fifth aliyah, verse 22, page 765. So we drove from Kadesh, came to a place called Hohahal, and that was like a mountain atop of a mountain. And this is the place where God tells Moses, it's time for Aaron to return his soul to the Creator. He's also not going to enter Israel. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar, place them in that mountain, and have Aaron give the garments, the special uniform of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, to his son Eleazar. He's going to be the high priest. He's going to be the president of the Supreme Court. And Aaron passed away there. And Rashi explains this in a very beautiful way. He says his son took over the uniform as Kohen Gadol, and then Aaron entered a cave, and he went in, and he saw a ready-made bed and a luminous candle, and he closed his eyes and passed away. And immediately, says Rashi, Moses coveted that same death. In Hebrew, we call it mot neshika. In English, when we say the kiss of death, it's not a positive thing. It's when somebody pretends to like you, but they really try to destroy you. But in Hebrew, we say mot neshika, which means death by way of a kiss. It means something completely different. It means what happened to Aaron. He went to bed, and he fell asleep forever. That's, by the way, what happened to Yeshayahu Leibovich, the Jewish philosopher I was just quoting. He was close to 90 years of age, and he went to sleep and didn't wake up. So my great-grandmother was watching TV with his wife and asked her for a nice cup of tea. And his wife, my great-grandmother, went to get him the tea. When she came back with the tea, he was already sleeping. So that's a good way to go, right?
Yeah.
That's a good way to go.
It's the best way.
Verse 27,
In your sleep.
Moses did everything that Hashem told him. And here's something really cute. On verse 29, it says that the entire people of Israel, the entire congregation, saw that Aaron passed away, and they cried for Aaron 30 days. So if you want to know why we have these gradations of mourning, right? There's the Shiva, and then there's 30 days, and then there's the year, right? 11 months, and then a year, right? When we lose an immediate relative, 30 days, right? Right here in the Torah. They mourned Aaron, they lamented, they cried for Aaron 30 days.
That's what they
And
shoshim, right?
right, and it says, Kol Beit Israel, the entire house of Israel. Now, here is Rashi. Notice, Rashi explains why. Because Aaron, it says in the Mishnah, was a pursuer of shalom and a lover of shalom, of peace. He loved people in general, human beings, and he would render them close to truth, to spirituality, to Torah. So people loved Aaron. Now, and here it says that Kol Beit Israel, the entire house of Israel, cried for him. When Moses passes away, towards the end of the Torah, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, it says that the house of Israel mourned him. It doesn't say Kol. It doesn't say the entire. And I think some commentators explain it in a way that Moses was admired beyond measure. And Moses was revered beyond measure. But Aaron was loved beyond measure. Aaron was the guy who also hugged them and told them a joke. Right? So that was a hard one for the nation. That was a really hard one for the nation. And then it continues, and it says, there's another group of people, the Canaanite, who is the king of Arad in the Negev in southern Israel. They fight with us, and we defeat them. And then on verse 5, which is on the very bottom of page 767, the people again complained to God and Moses, "Why did you take us from the desert, from Egypt, to die in the desert? There's no water here. There's no, except tap water." I'm just kidding. And there's no jebeta, there's no bread. And we're tired of eating manna, apropos Judith's question. And so something comes here that can seem very perplexing. It says that God sent snakes, venomous snakes, to attack the people. And look at and then on verse 8 on page 769, God says, make on a post like a serpent kind of statue, if you like, put it on a banner, and whoever was bitten by the snake shall see it and live.
Is this an idol?
So that's exactly the question. What the heck is going on? Right? The question that Mark just asked, an excellent question, is this an idol, is the question that the rabbis had, and it bothered them. So the explanation that our sages give to this episode in the Torah is that, what is the idea of whenever they looked at that copper-made snake, they would become healed? The sages say, and Rashi brings it forth as well, that whenever we uplift our gaze to our Father in heaven, we're healed. We can keep going, even though life sometimes we're bitten by snakes. The idea is that whenever we are spiritually centered, we're connecting to our own inner core and to the source of all life, then we can overcome the snakes that bite us and heal and integrate and move on. So the idea of symbolically looking on high is really about that, okay? And the parsha later on continues with additional. There's a poem we have about a well that comes into being, and of course the well on the inner meaning is about.
There's something interesting here.
Hold on, let me just wrap this, and then we'll hear your question, Judith, please. The water in the well represents Torah and the energy that Torah gives us. And in the last part of the parsha, which is, what is it, verse 21, you can find it on page 775. This time we're sending emissaries to Sichon, the king of the Amorites. He's also not letting us go through, and he's fighting us, and we defeat him, and we take a hold of various cities in what today is Transjordan. So I'm going to say one more thing, and I think, and then we'll hear Judith's question, and we'll end for today. There is a verse that I'd like you to look at. It's verse 27. It's on page. You don't have to look at it if you don't. I can kind of speak it out if you want. Verse 27 on page 777, and it says that the governors say, "Let us go to Cheshbon." The governors, meaning those who were municipal leaders of cities, right? The governors said, "Let us go to Cheshbon." Cheshbon was one of these places in Transjordan. So the cute thing is that the word Cheshbon in Hebrew also means arithmetic, like 1 + 1 = 2. So when you go to the Musar literature, which is the Jewish literature for ethical refinement, you find this verse interpreted in a very creative and deep way. He says, those who govern should go to Cheshbon, not Cheshbon the city, but to arithmetic. In other words, we should calculate. If I really feel like doing this thing, it's not the thing I'm going to feel bad after I do this thing. It's not something that's good for my soul. So those who govern their souls can do the arithmetic that 1 + 1 = 2. That if I'm going to do this, I'm going to feel lousy later, and I'm going to regret it. And it can tamper with my relationship with other people that I care about. It can tamper my relationship with my own self and with God. So those who can govern themselves, those who are not just enslaved to their wants and cravings, let them go to Cheshbon. Let them do the arithmetic of 1 + 1. If I go there and do that, what comes out? So it's like we say in Lecha Dodi that we sing on Friday night, the Kabbalistic poem, Sof ma'aseh b'machshava tchila. At the end comes the deed, the action that we take, but first machshava. First we think. What are going to be the outcome of that thing? Not now, not in an hour, maybe not even today, but the next day or a week from now. What are going to be the implications in my life if I do this or that? Okay? So now let's, Judith had a question.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that Rashi says interesting things about copper here.
Yes.
About copper, the terminology, the Holy One is called it snake, Nahash.
Yeah.
Snake, and
Moses called it
copper is
Nechoshet. So yeah, right. So Rashi explains that the word snake and the word copper in Hebrew are very similar. Nachash is snake, Nechoshet is copper. So Moses made those
is that why he
snake
made
out of
snake
copper.
Out of copper?
That's what Rashi says.
It's really interesting. I mean, it was another symbol of the people from the slaves from Egypt were still in that mindset of idols, and they needed something.
Right, I think that's
transition.
Very good. So I think it's a great point. We know from history and archaeology that there were times in which the ancient Egyptians worshipped cats. Right? Not that there's anything wrong with that. Some of my best friends are cats. Jennifer Katz from New York, Steve Katz from Miami Beach. But
I grew up with a couple of cats.
But that's part of it. Another thing that Rashi says
at school
to
in my class.
To complement your point, Judith, is that the snake misled Eve from eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden. And the snake represents saying vile things, defamation. And they were defaming Moses, saying, why did you take us out of Egypt, this wonderful place where we were slaved and we were dehumanized, and Pharaoh decreed genocide against us? Why did you take us out of Egypt here? So, the snake represents duplicity, also because of the way the snake moves about in a crooked sort of way. We'll end by saying that the Haftarah, the prophetic reading for this week, is taken from the book of Judges. It's a story of Jephthah in English, who was from the Gilad, Transjordan. We just conquered these areas in Transjordan at the end of the Parsha, and he made an oath that is kind of very shocking. He made an oath that if he wins the war, whoever comes back from the war, he is going to... whoever is going to come and greet me when I come back from the war, I'm going to bring that person as an offering to God. And guess who came to greet him when he came home? His own daughter. Oops. So of course we know that there's nothing more heinous to God and Judaism than the idea of human sacrifice. And that's the whole point of the story of the binding of Isaac, that God tells Abraham, human sacrifice, that's exactly what I don't want. All the pagans are doing it, but we don't want that. We still have human sacrifice in the world, right? When we see in radical Islam that teenagers are being sent to be suicide bombers, that's human sacrifice. That's political and idolatry. So that's the end. And the reason we have this Haftarah is that it's a war in Transjordan, and in the Torah portion we had a war that takes place in Transjordan. Okay? So we'll stop here. Wish everyone a good day, and thank you for learning Torah together.